We move voluntarily to feel good, we move to get stronger, we move for peace of mind, and some of us move involuntarily, repeatedly. Hello and welcome to Tic Fit the podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things movement in both the exercise sphere and in life with Tourette Syndrome. This is a platform to discuss Tourette Syndrome and its effects on our bodies. We'll speak with movement professionals where we can advocate and educate about Tourette Syndrome, while the Tourette community can benefit from the expertise of these individuals. We'll also speak with professionals about Tourette syndrome and other tic disorders. I'm your host, Raquel Cunningham, and I've been on a quest for the past 2 decades to discover the connection between movement, exercise, and our ticking muscles. This is not meant to diagnose or treat Tourette syndrome. There is no cure for Tourette syndrome. We are here to advocate and educate about Tourette through conversation, and anything in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Please always consult with your doctor before beginning any exercise program to make sure that it's right for you. Hello and welcome, everybody. I am so incredibly excited to have Dr. Christine Conelea here with us today. She is a clinical psychologist and director of the Minnesota Tic and Compulsivity Lab, which aims to improve understanding and care of Tourette syndrome, tic disorders, and OCD. Her work covers a wide range of topics, including developing new tools for diagnosis and new treatments. Her work aims to engage the community throughout the research process to make sure findings are meaningful and impactful to the tic and OCD communities. Dr. Connolly, I'm so excited to have you here. We get to talk about the brain.
Yay. Thank you so much for having me, Raquel. This is exciting for me too.
Yeah, this is, gosh, my 5-year-old ticking self would be really, I don't know, hopeful to hear all of the things that you guys are doing in the lab.
Yeah.
But I have an analogy for how I describe just neurodivergence, especially considering that I have Tourette syndrome. But then I can also use this analogy for explaining, developing, and learning new movement patterns. And that's with or without Tourette syndrome. So we use the idea of brain bridges. And, if you see the picture, well, you've seen them, but the pictures of the little neurosynapses, and how they build and grow and cross from place to place. But to use this analogy of a brain bridge, you have to build a new structure. Tics get really good at building their own brain bridges, and you get very good at doing your tics. So what if we make these new brain bridges to create new movement patterns? And you have to start from the foundation. You have to grow. It is repetition, meaningful repetition to build these new movement patterns. And in the training world, even in the therapeutic physical therapy world, it's called neuromuscular reeducation. You're building these new movement patterns to train the brain, and so that your muscles can communicate effectively and efficiently, after injury or with neurological condition. So what brain bridges do you choose to build? Well, another big word I can throw out right away is reciprocal inhibition. That's a phenomenon in training that if you're working one group, it automatically relaxes the antagonistic training group. And, we had a couple occupational therapists on, Shannon Floyd and Dr. Debbie Heinerfeld, to discuss what CBIT is. But that's my analogy of Tourette. I love analogies. I think you love analogies. But can you explain to us how the Tourette brain works?
Yeah.
What is going on?
This is a great question. And yes, I have an analogy I would love to go through that I've sort of pieced together. And it's my take on what I'll say is a really big body of research literature that includes different kinds of neuroscience methods like brain imaging, looking at how brain systems work across species. And the good news is that even in the time I've been studying Tourette's, we have a much better understanding of what is happening in the brain. And so what all this research sort of centers on are these circuits in the brain called the corticostriatal thalamocortical circuits. I promise I'll get more simple after that. The CSTC circuits. So if you kind of zoom back, like there used to be this thought that like different regions of the brain did different things. But what we've learned over the last couple decades is that the brain is really organized into what we call circuits or networks. So it's really like the coordination of different areas of the brain together that help accomplish the different tasks that our brain is doing. And so these CSTC circuits, I want you to imagine a train track system. And so these are kind of like train tracks that are going in the brain from deep inside the brain, what we call the subcortex, and then they're going to travel up to the top of the brain, the cortex, and travel back. And so deep in the brain, we have this really important structure called the basal ganglia. And we think this is sort of like the origin of where those tic movement messages are coming from. So kind of think of the basal ganglia as like the train yard where all the trains come in and kind of get loaded up with materials. And you can think of these materials as neurotransmitters or those chemicals in the brain. So they're kind of getting loaded up there. And then they're going to travel up to the middle of the brain to this spot called the thalamus. And that's kind of like your Grand Central Station where you sort of have the last spot before your train tracks are going to go to different places. So they're going to pass through the thalamus, and then you're going to have these tracks separate out, and each one has a slightly different function. So one of those tracks is what we call the sensory motor circuit. And just like it sounds like, it travels up to the top of our brain that is right next to movement. And so that circuit is responsible for those urges we feel to move and then for actually like doing a movement. And what we know in Tourette's is that circuit is over-connected and overactive. So it's kind of like there's too many trains going on that movement track. So we have the excess movement. At the same time, we have another track that's traveling out towards the front of the brain, and we call this the control circuit or the associative circuit. So it's traveling out to the front of our brain, and this area of our brain is responsible for doing things like taking in information about the situation we're in and then helping decide what movements to put the brake on. So kind of like filtering out which movements are and aren't helpful for the task we have in front of us. It's also the circuit, if you hear about, like people talk about executive functioning, it's that part of our brain that's sort of like the planner, the reasoning, the sort of higher order thinking. It's that part. And so what we know in Tourette is that part of the brain when it's developing is a bit underconnected and underactive. So I kind of think of this as like almost like a squeaky brake. So I'm mixing analogies a little, right? But you have sort of like too much gas and a squeaky brake at the same time. And then there's a third loop in that circuit that connects to emotion areas of the brain. So the things like the amygdala, which is really responsible for our having like anxious responses. And so that train track kind of has like a hyper connection to the movement part of the brain. So what that means is that emotions can have a stronger impact on movement in people with tics. So this is like a lot of people with tics will describe like, oh, when I'm more stressed out or anxious, right? I tend to tic more. Yes. And that's yeah. So it's like, that's what's connecting those two together.
That's crazy. That's like a very, not simplified because it is still so complex and interwound, but just such a concise description of all of these circuits. Because I mean, even until recently, I was still under the impression that this part was where we moved and this part was where we thought and this part was where we felt things. But it was actually your presentation at the National Tourette Conference last year with another doctor where you guys showed images of these circuitries in the brain. And it was mind-blowing, in fact, because it was the first time I'd ever seen images of these circuits firing. But
yeah, I mean, I'm so glad to hear that, because that's part of our hope is to sort of, how can we take what we learn to help people understand, their experience. And what I think is really interesting too, when you start to think about it from the circuitry perspective, is like I said, they're all connected together deep in the brain.
Right.
And so this is why, like, when people, no one with tics really has like just tics, like they're probably having a lot of other experiences too, related to like urges to move and movement. And we'll talk about what you brought up with like the superpower of movement learning. or there's a lot of co-occurring ADHD or OCD. And it's because these circuits are all they're all like communicating and next to each other in the brain. So it's the other thing I like to sort of emphasize is it's not like a bunch of different things that are happening when people are experiencing different symptoms. It's all the same exact brain circuits that are just interacting together to kind of drive those experiences. So it's like one thing.
You know what? That actually still is more comforting too, because then if there's something you want to adjust or manage or change, it's not like you have to jump from this area and jump from this area. It's all one thing can influence a lot.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
that's encouraging, so you don't have to work your ADHD separately from the tics, from whatnot. But I myself didn't realize the extent of my co-occurring conditions until college. The anxiety, the true like analysis paralysis, living in my fight or flight life. But that makes sense. So speaking of these co-occurring conditions, oftentimes OCD, anxiety, ADHD, depression. I was actually lucky enough, they allowed me to audit the CBIT certification back in 2020. And with the hope of everything that I'm, pouring into these exercise programs, that it makes sense with CBIT. But it was during that certification, something new came up, which isn't it's not a diagnosis on its own, but Tourettic OCD. It was fascinating to be hearing all of this information, thinking, okay, how can I put this into a program? But then drawing upon my own experience and for it to make sense. Oh, that's what I was going through. But this idea of Tourettic OCD, that there can be a mental tic as well, was really fascinating. But my question is, what is the difference between impulsivity and involuntary movements? Is it the premonitory urge? Like, what is that dance between those?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would just add in a third concept here, which is compulsivity. So we have impulsivity, yes. compulsivity, yes. And then like, what are tics? Okay. And so there is a lot of thinking that these two circuits that I was talking about, like that movement circuit and the brake circuit, right? If we kind of think about those are two that are super involved in all these constructs. So compulsivity, we think about as like over habitized behavior. So it's like persisting in doing the same thing the same way over and over, even if maybe that behavior is no longer helpful or like no longer working. So that's where you see things like in OCD, people might have really movement-like symptoms, like maybe they have to like repeat getting up and down out of a chair until it feels right, which can look a lot like a tic, right? Like doing a movement a certain way, or like stereotypies that we see in autism, where people are doing a movement sequence over and over. And so that compulsivity, we think, is driven by this imbalance of like there's too much strength in that motor system. Like it's making it harder to deviate from a set routine. And then impulsivity we think of as a lack of the lack of the brake coming on, like when you have an urge to do something and your brain is having a harder time integrating, like, yes, that my coworker just said something really snarky and I want to swear at them in the meeting. Right. but I am noticing that I'm in this context where it wouldn't be appropriate to say that. I'm going to put on the brake. So we think of impulsivity as this more like when you have an urge and then the brake isn't engaging and it's just kind of happening. So like kind of doing things without thinking about it first. Okay. And that's really that frontal circuit I was talking about being more underactive. And then where are tics? Like they're kind of both, right? Because like I said, both of those circuits are involved. And so that's why we sort of see this variety among people of like, some of them have more of the OCD stuff, probably because that sensory motor circuit is more impaired than their frontal circuit. Some people have more ADHD, probably because it's that frontal circuit that's doing more labor. And the last thing is like, the other thing we know is that these are all changing across development. And that motor circuit is one of the earliest things that actually develops in our brain and becomes like solidified. But that frontal circuit, that doesn't stop developing till you're like 26. And so a lot of people develop better control over impulsivity just by getting older, and certainly by practicing and things like that. So did that kind of get at your question, Raquel?
Yes,
or was
very
there something
much so.
else in
Very
there?
much
Okay,
so.
okay,
Nope, that
okay.
was it, because those are, I don't even think I asked it as clearly as you explained it. You're like, I think I know what you're asking. This is what you,
Awesome.
Yes. You know, it's funny. I really love these blaze pods, these tools. It's basically like these little light up lights, and you can do it for different sports. And what I've noticed, whether I was coaching soccer or whether I use it with training in the gym, is if somebody is so overly impulsive, they don't last as long while doing it because they're so frantic about it. Go, 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 hit, 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 hit. And they don't have as much endurance with it. So like, what a fun way to train how to be quick, have a good reactionary time, but also like with a clear, focused mind that you can do that for a minute versus 15 seconds before you just burn out and have no idea where you're at in space anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great example of using like anything like external cues that sort of help our brain remember like what situation it's in, right? Like, oh yeah, I'm doing this. I have this goal, and this visual is so good for developing also that part of our, not just our physical body, but like exercising that part of our brain too.
Right, to get those two to connect, whatever circuit that's on too. So where is movement? Well, I guess where do impulses like reside in the brain? Because that's movement. Do impulses and involuntary movement and voluntary movement, are those all in the same circuit in the brain?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, in terms of like, so that sensory motor circuit I talked about, it kind of connects these two regions, like right in the middle of your head. Like think about like between your ears, if you put a headband between your ears.
Okay.
That's going to be what we call your primary motor cortex. And then right next to it is your sensory motor cortex. So that's like the top layer of that circuit is going to be up there. And so the sensory motor cortex is the pre-movement experiences that we have like an urge to move. So there's like these cool spots in the brain on that area where like in neuroimaging research, for example, you put people in the scanner, and when they see a picture of an object you can grasp, that part of the brain becomes active without actually like grabbing something. So it's kind of the earliest place that's encoding, like I'm kicking off a movement signal, and like, this part of the supplementary motor area is part of that sensory motor strip. Like there's been some cool research that it's the exact same area for urges to tic, urges to yawn, urges to go to the bathroom. Like that sense of like, I need to do a movement is all happening right there. And
so then, is that interoception? Is that what that word means?
I mean, I would say like interoception is sort of your awareness of that feeling, right? Because some people are like, if you think about like potty training a kid, they're having that activation in their brain, but they don't learn to notice it until they have the experience, right? So we kind of have there's like the brain signal, and then how much we're able to notice it in the moment is what I would call interoception. And like different people have different amounts of sensitivity to noticing that, right? Like, and we know actually people with tics, it's going to be, because that's overactive, they're going to have more urges, and they're actually probably going to be more aware of it, and it might feel more uncomfortable. So a lot of people might have more of these like sensory issues, or like certain, I mean, thinking about what you do, like certain physical exercises or activities might feel like less comfortable because the sensation around it is heightened.
Completely. Yes, I see that.
Yes. So, okay, so we have this sensory motor area, and then that area is sending the movement message to that primary motor cortex. And then from there, those are the neurons that connect down to like your spine and actually send the movement out to like your peripheral muscles and nerves. Now you sort of brought up an interesting question of like what is voluntary and involuntary is actually like a super interesting question, and like
that's my world where I live. Yes.
Yeah, like especially with tics, right? Like what is that? And I guess I think of tics as living in this. It's kind of voluntary and involuntary in the same way that breathing is. Like we all are involuntarily breathing often. We can exert voluntary control over it. So that is when the front of your brain is kicking in and is like, okay, wait, like let's actually change our breathing pattern right now. And we can do that, but it takes effort and we can't do it forever. And but so that's sort of the dimension I think tics live in, is it's like it just, so a lot of people will say like, I hear a lot of kids that I work with, they get really frustrated because people are telling them like, well, you can stop them sometimes, so can't you just like not do them? And I kind of have to tell people, okay, well, that's kind of like, you can do deep breathing sometimes, but can you do that all the time? No, that's really, really hard.
You'll hyperventilate. It's not.
Yeah.
There's a time and a place for it. And in a talk I gave, I actually drew a mountain, and it was basically like tic momentum. So if you have this stressor, or you have excitement, or you have a test coming up, if you're trying to inhibit, suppress, it builds, and it's going to come out like you're going down a mountain full force. Like that's not the time to do deep breathing work.
Yeah.
Like it's, it's your tics are coming out. You kind of just have to ride that wave, but there is a time and place to do deep breath work. I learned all about breathing from swimming. That was my training space where I understood that this was something controllable. I'd never even like to use the word controllable, but when you're swimming, your breath is so rationed. When you're running, you don't get one breath and then 3 steps, and then one breath and then 3 steps, but you do in swimming. So I had to learn, okay, we would do drills, swim across the pool with 1 breath. Like, oh, you can do that? Is that a thing? But so that's when all of a sudden the breath, there's a great book out called Body by Breath by Jill Miller. And in the very beginning, she talks about how she had asthma, and with the diaphragm muscle, why didn't anybody tell the asthmatic kid that you have a breathing muscle? Why can't we not talk more about, tics, breathing tics, sniffling tics, vocal tics, that there's a breathing muscle and there's different ways to access it. But what have you found do you guys do deep breath work in your guys' practice, or when and how do you approach that? Because like you just said, it's not something that you can do all day, every day.
You'll pass exactly. Right. And I think about it as like, I'll talk about the breathing specifically, but like a lot of what we focus on in CBIT is kind of thinking about like helping people practice that, like, okay, I'm going to use that prefrontal cortex to voluntarily like engage my brake in my brain and exercise that brake, so that over time it's sort of helping counterbalance the overactive motor. And so I think it's really an interesting kind of open question of like, does it matter exactly how you're doing that? Like, does it have to be breathing or like a different kind of like voluntary behavior? Like, I'm not sure. But the way breathing comes up for us, we haven't, done it. Sometimes we teach it in more of a like trying to help kids, with their sympathetic arousal and kind of trying to like, okay, let's turn down that anxiety. So what anxiety does too, like you're talking about the mountain, it actually it tires out the front of your brain. So it's not really that the movement is like building up, it's that you're exhausting your brake.
Interesting.
Right. And so like, that's why when you're like really tired, when we're stressed, all of us, when we're tired, when we're stressed, we don't inhibit as well. And then the more and more, right? Like, and so it's kind of like the regular things, like regularly, like your swimming example, right? Like regularly practicing, like I'm going to engage my prefrontal cortex to do this really systematic movement. It's strengthening that so it has more capacity to like withstand stress.
We're building a new brain bridge.
Exactly. It's a new brain bridge. And like, what I love about your work, Raquel, is like, you're really thinking about how does the outside of the brain body, how do we work with that to strengthen the brain bridge? And I do think like breathing is one of them. We have a lot of kids who, when they have a vocal tic, we're teaching them like, okay, how do you bring your breathing under voluntary control when you have that urge, and then ride that out.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you questions, but
yes,
I mean,
of course,
that
please,
would be my question
please.
for you, is like, because I think this is really interesting. Like, what are your thoughts about like how could we be better thinking about what we're doing with our non-brain body to help like connect those brain bridges? Because they're so intertwined, like we're talking about.
They're so intertwined, and that's the area I love to live in. I do a lot of breath work with people. I've worked with people with a lot of injury, and teaching how breathing mechanics work becomes really helpful and impactful. You know, your breath isn't just inhale, exhale. A lot of people, let me back up for a minute. You know, we need the whole respiratory system. You have in through your nose, of course, and into your lungs. But for your lungs to expand, you have this big dome diaphragm that descends as you inhale. And then your pelvic floor has to accept that. That has to go somewhere. So your pelvic floor and your transverse abdominis are part of this system. And then when you exhale, the diaphragm ascends, your pelvic floor recoils, and your transverse can engage. So the exhale becomes really, really important in firing this whole, you know, they liken it to a piston system. But now the interesting thing is if this system is not working as optimally as it could be, we become chest breathers up and through here. And then all your neck is working. And you would know the percentages better than I do of people that have head and neck tics, but it's pretty high. And so if people are not breathing optimally, and that they're compensating with their breath with these muscles that they're already working with their tics, you know, that's not central up there. But so in teaching breath work, there's a lot of different ways to do it. But to first of all, just understand the mechanics of it, as opposed to just being repetitively told, okay, slow down, take a breath, take a breath. I, you know, worked with a lot of kids and they're so burnt out on that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if all of a sudden you say, do a side stretch and then breathe through the right side of your lung. Oh, that part moves. You can do it this way. Breathe through this left side. Lying flat on your back and putting like a moderately weighted, that was a weird sentence, but a sandbag of moderate weight, you know, between 10 and 15 pounds on the lower abdomen so that you can feel this whole system fire, so that when you inhale, it would rise. When you exhale, it would drop. But different sensory inputs so that you can feel this new pattern on the body. The tricky thing about breath work, it will take 2 weeks of conscious, repetitive work to even feel what we're talking about. Then it takes another 2 weeks to try to gain some level of intentional engagement and activation of this transverse abdominis and the whole system. And then it might still take another weeks before you can actually control it and willfully put it into other movements. So, you know, I'd be so curious. Somebody with a vocal tic, I would weight them in the front because that's more challenging on your abdomen in a deep squat. You know, you have to make sure their body can handle that, but that's kind of a competing response to a really intense vocal tic because we're challenging the diaphragm.
I think this is so cool. Yes. I mean, I love this too. You know what is interesting? I mentioned this superpower is like, because the motor circuit is more active, like people who have tics, there's research on this, actually like learn and what we call habitize. So kind of like that effortful learning to it becoming automatic happens faster.
Yeah.
And so it almost makes me wonder, right? Like what you're talking about, like, I wonder if some of those timelines are actually faster for some people who have tics, because I mean, you have a lot of them are athletes, are musicians,
right.
like a lot of these like sort of vocations that pull for really strong motor learning and coordination.
Yeah.
And I think this is really what like this conversation highlights for me too, like where I think to really be helping people with tics, it takes multiple disciplines thinking in different ways because it's a full brain, body, environment, social experience. And I think
Completely.
where like a lot of our work has been limited is like, if I'm just approaching this as a psychologist and, you're just approaching this, like we don't sort of have that crosstalk of like, oh, wait, actually these fit together and how they could make something maybe work. Both of these do work better together, I think. So I think this is just like sort of an exciting way to think about the science of both of these things together.
I couldn't agree more. That's honestly why the podcast came to be. I realized in doing programs, because I do, offer and sell programs, but I'll bring other movement professionals on here because if mine doesn't work for somebody, everybody's tics and body types are different. Go try theirs. And then at the same token, to understand more about Tourette's that I'm still learning from people like you every single day, and to have these conversations that I don't know have ever really been had like this before.
No.
So,
No.
and enter, multidisciplinary tic help.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, that would be my dream clinical support for people is having a full
right.
team.
So, a quick plug for you though, because you are at the University of Minnesota, right?
Yes, I am.
Which is, you guys are doing incredible lab work, and you guys need participants from time to time, right?
We love our participants and having them partner with us in this. It's not possible,
Right.
without participants. Yes.
You guys have an online way for people to help participate in studies, right?
We do, yes. So yeah, we have we have one online study right now, and we're going to be rolling out a lot if people are interested. Our lab website is ticlab.umn.edu. And we have a registry, so you can sign up on there. And then we have a newsletter where we share out results coming out from our studies. We have a patient advisory board that we work with, so everything is very, we do a lot of work to make sure we're doing things that are responsive to what the community is asking for. And so you can sign up for our registry, and then we have lots of different study opportunities. The one we're running online, I'm really excited about. It's funded by the NIH, and it's a project to try to improve access to diagnosis. So all the things we're talking about right now, like assume that somebody understands that they have this condition. And what we know from the research is it's about 3 to 11 years for people to go from the time their tics start to when they get a diagnosis.
That's what, 3 to 11?
3 to 11 years. And then we also know that rates of getting diagnosed are even lower among people who have minoritized backgrounds because they have lower access to care. And so we have a huge problem with even like people understanding that this is what their experience is. And so what we're doing in this study is using some software or technology to figure out like how can we take just a brief video of someone and be able to tell like, hey, yes, this person has tics, make sure they get the right care. Trying to kind of use technology to get rid of those barriers of wait lists for professionals. And so we're hoping to have lots of people to make sure it's really representative of the full range. But yeah, I
think that's amazing. It's really, I mean, first of all, it's just pioneering research that you guys are doing, but then with the intent of accessibility for treatment.
Yeah.
Which is huge.
It's huge.
I've spoken with several adults that didn't get diagnosed until later in life. And there's a yearning, there's a grief in there.
Absolutely.
From missing out on what could have been. So I really applaud all of the work and effort you guys are doing. It's really incredible. I'm really inspired by it.
Thank you.
Yes. So I'm learning how to do show notes. So we'll put your lab in the show notes.
Lovely. I appreciate it. And we're always like, if anybody's listening and just like even wants to get in touch with us, like we love questions, we love input. We're here really for the community and want to be sure what we're doing is relevant and impactful. So
The Tourette community is really incredible.
It really is. It's incredible.
Everybody, there's such a deep understanding of the unique differences that everybody has, but still somebody can describe an urge and somebody else can be like, oh, I know that feeling. I know what it's like to urge and tic and then try to go through life or go through your day.
Yeah. And that's, that's something we want to do a better job of in the research, is really like listening to that, because a lot of the, we just have some new data we were looking at in the lab where we're actually sort of asking like, okay, when people come to us for treatment, what is it that they're struggling with? And a lot of it are things like pain. Pain is a huge one.
It hurts,
right?
Emotions hurt. There's
a tic, and these are
just
things
because
like we just haven't done a good enough. You're thinking a lot about this. In my world, it's less like, oh, this hasn't been on our radar. We have to listen.
It's just because you don't want to be doing emotion doesn't mean that the body's not doing it. There's still, a result on the body of internally rotating and depressing your shoulder while rotating your head the other direction. I have two questions here. I'm kind of backtracking us a little bit.
That's all
First
good.
of all, going back to some of the breath stuff, like to talk about the central nervous system a little bit. You mentioned, sympathetic arousal. What have you guys found about sympathetic arousal and then a parasympathetic downshift? Because breath work in the training world right now and the parasympathetic system, there's a really incredible advance on that. And there's exercises that people are doing and focusing on how to create this parasympathetic downshift to combat the everyday overstimulation of life, tics or not. But can you talk to the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic and what you have found in clinic with anything?
Sure. Yeah. So I think of these as they're both part of what we call our body's alarm system. And so it's this very, basic system in our body that's designed to keep us safe in the face of danger. And so if the classic, if we were out in the woods and a bear jumped out in front of us, our sympathetic and nervous system would kick on. So it's going to activate what's called our fight, flight, or freeze system that, again, is designed to keep us safe. And so what happens physiologically is a lot of changes in our body in order to activate in the face of threat. So you're going to get things like your heart rate goes up, your breathing goes up, your palms get sweaty, your digestion actually like kind of shuts off because it's like that's not necessary. So it's like the stomach aches. And so the system that's designed to bring us back to our baseline is the parasympathetic system. So that's going to be what brings, your heart rate down, brings your breathing back to regular. And we do know that like people who have, for example, anxiety disorders or who have had trauma, that alarm system can become like too sensitive. And so it's like going off when maybe there isn't something dangerous. Or in our modern world, maybe that goes off because you like see a news headline that scares you, or somebody looks at you a way you don't, right? So our alarm can be really sensitive. And so you can get this high like physiological arousal that's really draining on our body and on our brain because it's releasing all these cortisol hormones that can be really taxing on our brain. So my dissertation for my PhD was actually about how stress impacted tics. And I didn't like it was back in the days when we didn't have great like technology for monitoring things like heart rate, like some of these physiological indicators. So I didn't have that at the time. But what was interesting was sort of what I was alluding to earlier of like what I thought would happen. So we had kids come into the lab and then I did this like timed mental math task. So it was like, they were doing math problems that were just like a little bit too hard for them. And then if they didn't get it in time, it'd be like, Rah! So it was a little stressful. And, I thought, oh, their tics are going to get worse because they're stressed out. And what I actually found was that the tics were not different from when they weren't stressed from baseline.
Really?
Yeah. But what happened was, so we measured tics when kids were just kind of sitting there at rest. when they were trying to suppress, we said like, just do your best to voluntarily control your tics. And then we did the same two things. Well, so then just be stressed out and then be stressed out and try to control your tics. And what we found, so it didn't make tics worse, but it made them much harder to control. So that's kind of getting at that idea I was talking about of like, when we're stressed, it really turns off our brain's brake. It doesn't make us have more movement, right? It's exhausting it. It's freezing it. It's really making that tired. So that's the reason, your question is fantastic about like, are there then things we can do like these to mechanistically like activate parasympathetic? I haven't seen any research on that in tics specifically. And I think it's a really interesting and important question to ask for sure. But I don't know. I don't know. What I would guess is like, what I would probably guess is that like, so the weird thing in our brain too is like when our fear system is active, it's on like a seesaw with our prefrontal cortex, like our rational mind. So like when we are really like scared and in that fight flight response, it's like our rational brain like shuts off. So like, when you're really upset and people try to talk to you like you're reasonable, it doesn't work. It's like, like that, right? Like
there's a reason.
Yeah, there's a reason. It's like literally your reasoned mind doesn't work. And so once you're back to like your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and you're back to like even keel, then your rational mind and your control systems kick back online. So it almost makes me wonder, like, would you want to do something like, could we give actually people something that helps them get back to like, okay, let's turn on your parasympathetic system, help you regulate, and then you can use like these skills that require the front of your brain. I don't know, but
that question is what has driven me throughout discovering movement.
I love that.
Like that's driven it. Because there's been times I have worked with people with tics and we've done, breath work. We've done just through movement, trying to work these antagonistic ticking muscles. And there's a moment when you see a change happen in them where they slow down, like they all of a sudden stop focusing on you and start just feeling something brand new. And there's a downshift. But you can physically see when it happens. And I want to know, what is that? Because you can't do a scan and be like, oh, you're in your parasympathetic system, right? That doesn't, or can you?
I mean, I don't recall. I put people in the scanner all the time. We could come
That's
up
true.
With
That's true.
I mean, there are some good, it's now much easier to measure things like heart rate, respiration. So a colleague in my lab, Brianna Wellen, she's actually running a study now where we have participants wearing Fitbits all the time. And then they're getting pinged on their phone a couple times a day to give us like ratings of like, what are your emotions? What are your tics like? So we're trying to do a better job of at least capturing like in real life as these things are happening, like how are these things fluctuating?
Right. What's the ebb and flow of it?
Yeah. So I could imagine a study where you could do that, right? Like actually have people wearing some of these wearables, you can get pretty good physiological data now. And like sort of what does it look like as they're going through these different activities?
It'd be so intriguing. I'd be so curious to see what it would be like to have somebody do like heavy workload, because that can help reorganize the body. Do heavy workload, then do CBIT, or do heavy workload just as is, or to do, swimming plus CBIT, to see all of this, even to do targeted strength training by body part or targeted strength training with CBIT. And so the big pie in the sky dream is one day that I could help fund that. Yeah. What if this got so big that that's the goal, to drive some of those conversations.
Yeah. And it's, there's actually some really cool research happening in this space around anxiety and trauma, where they're doing like, can we do intense exercise right before someone does their therapy session?
Oh,
and
really?
So there is some thinking that like that process is helping consolidate the learning that's happening in the treatment too. Because like, among other things, exercise does it helps heighten neuroplasticity. So that's like the capacity for your brain to build bridges is neuroplasticity. And we have variable amounts of that, and things like exercise, it's creating all this amazing plasticity that we could be thinking about better in treatment, I think.
It's just wildly, endlessly fascinating, and just how the brain works, evolves, and moves and changes, and how it can keep growing is just, it's incredible. How did you get into neurology?
So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I originally started, when I finished undergrad, I knew I wanted to do therapy, and I was interested in kids, and I happened to get into grad school with Doug Woods, who was at the time running a study to actually test CBIT and if it works. And so that was my job that paid my tiny stipend as a grad student to run this study and work with participants. But I just like you said, the Tourette community is incredible. And I just loved working with these families and with the other people who are interested in helping this community. And then I was doing learning these therapy approaches. And as I kind of went on through my career, I became really interested in the patients of mine that I couldn't help. So the ones that, we tried therapy, they're trying meds, they're trying all this stuff. And that got me down the path of I really want to learn more about the brain, because that's we have to know about both to do that. And so, I was fortunate to get a training award from the NIH as an early career investigator that really helped me. I got into neuroimaging. I got into non-invasive brain stimulation, where we use magnets to sort of change how circuits talk to each other. And I know. It's a whole other thing I do. But it really, that's sort of now I feel I just love thinking about this, really, how is the brain interacting with people's experiences and their environment, and how can we use that information to help people meet their own goals? That's what's exciting to me.
And the fact that you're doing that for the Tourette community, that's, I think, incredible information for any human to know, but to, be pioneering that for those of us with tics is really just next level. What does that look like in the lab? What is this magnet?
We
talk about it a little bit, but there's still something to learn.
Yeah, so we use this tool. It's a medical device called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. And basically it's a hand-sized magnet. And when you pass electricity through a magnet really fast, it creates a magnetic field. And then if you put, I cannot help you out this too. I have a fun video, TikTok and Instagram video of me doing this to myself if people want to see.
Yes.
So basically that electromagnetic field can, when you hold it against the scalp, it can activate the neurons underneath it. And so what's interesting is depending on how you make those pulses happen, if they happen really slow, that turns down neurons. And if we pulse it really fast, it turns up neurons.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah. And so it's an improved treatment in adults with depression and OCD. It's experimental in everyone else. But we're doing some studies in the lab to say okay, can we use this? We're focused right now on that sensory motor circuit in Tourette's. And I have another study in OCD where we're doing both sensory motor and that frontal circuit. So we're saying, okay, we know that this motor circuit is overactive. Can we use TMS to turn it down? We know that this other one is underactive. Can we use TMS to turn it up? And then we do that right before kids go into their therapy session. So kind of this idea of plasticity I was talking about, can we help boost the way the brain is functioning so that when someone goes into their session, it's ready to receive and learn in a way that is enhanced, basically. And it's been really exciting. And we just finished one phase, and we're finding that we can do that. We can change that circuitry. And we're just starting a new phase of that study to see in a bigger group to see does this really help with symptoms?
Amazing.
So it's another exciting area. Yeah.
Research is so exciting. It's so exciting. It's so exciting. I don't know, my brain is exploding.
That's good. It's, sometimes when you're in the grind of it, like it doesn't feel it's like, oh, we're just every day
Right.
doing the work. But I feel really lucky and really honored to be able to like do this work. That's hopefully going to be meaningful.
Well, we are incredibly appreciative of people like you doing that for, I don't know, this beautiful balance of being incredibly good at it, interested in it, and pursuing it. I can't imagine getting these awards came easy to.
No, and for those of you listening, the NIH is an incredible, National Institute of Health is an incredible institution that funds
Yes.
a lot of this work. And that is becoming uncertain. So, everything we can do to advocate for continued funding of research, it's like this is the backbone of like what helps us answer these questions. So
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Conelea. This
thank
has
you,
been
Raquel.
enlightening, exciting, and I'm just really excited to see how this manifests.
Me too. Thanks so much for
But
having me.
yeah, so grateful for you. Thank you. Thank you.
We love providing a platform for sharing ideas about living with Tourette syndrome and other tic disorders. While we strive to keep the content evidence-based, please understand that exercise science, information about Tourette syndrome, and its co-occurring conditions are constantly evolving. The content shared in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. By listening to this podcast, you agree to not use the information as a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment for yourself or your child. As always, consult your healthcare provider before making any medical decisions or starting any treatments related to Tourette syndrome or other health conditions, which also includes mental health. This disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast. TicFit and the podcast team do not take any responsibility for any actions taken based on the information provided. Our goal is to educate, support, and raise awareness, not to diagnose or treat any medical condition. Thanks for listening.